Bismillah wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers and listeners. Welcome to the year 2025, the first recorded episode of season 4 of the Scholar and the Student podcast. We're using a little bit of a new software, that's why I am invisible. Nothing's happened to me. I am still fine, alhamdulillah, still happily married, and still the host of Botswana's first Muslim podcast. And I thought we'd start with something of a back to basics episode, and perhaps what I mean by that will be elucidated as we go on. We have a brother here all the way from the United States of America. Unfortunately, I did not have the courtesy to ask him which of the states and which part of the states. So, brother Waleed Sami, my apologies for that, but assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Botswana virtually. Could you introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from. What are you working on? What do you study? Everything that we would like to know about you.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me. I'm currently based in New York City to be specific. I'm originally from Virginia, which is a state also on the East Coast, and I moved up here recently. My profession is I'm a professor, and I teach within mental health counseling. I train and develop the next generation of mental health therapists who do psychotherapy, counseling, and all sorts of work that way. So my initial expertise is mental health, and I have, evolving expertise and a professional relationship with questions, say, of labor, economics, and equality. They actually kind of fuse together. One leads to the other. Maybe we can get into that a little bit. Before I became a professor, I practiced as a mental health therapist. So I did psychotherapy, and I work with people of all backgrounds. And I, kind of did that for a long time. And so right now I'm currently working as a professor where I do a lot of teaching and research, with maybe the intent to start practicing again in a couple of years. I think that's okay for an introduction, unless you have some more specific questions, and I can get into that in time, inshallah.
No, mashallah, I think that's pretty awesome. That's great, mashallah. And I thought, because when we started talking, we only started talking about labor and capitalism, cooperatives, all that stuff. I was completely oblivious to the fact that you had this background in mental health, and I'm very appreciative for that introduction. And as courtesies goes, my name is Mustaqim Habib. I'm an attorney by profession. I'm a lawyer. That's what I studied. I also do this podcast, and if you've seen, some of my episodes, I did send you one. I just started playing guitar again. So if you want to say astaghfirullah, I completely understand. Some people say that's cool. Well, yeah, that's what I do. I recently got married. My wife was in my last episode of season 3. So I guess, yeah, that's more or less what there is about me. And I guess as time goes on, I'll unravel more about myself. So, Professor Waleed, if I may, now that I know that you are an actual professor, we started talking, as I mentioned, about something called labor, about something called capitalism. Now, the thing about these terms is that whomsoever you talk to, they seem to signify different meanings. So when you talk about in your work capitalism, you talk about labor relationships, you talk about the value of labor, what are you referring to? And tell us more about some of the things you've written. I know your background is in mental health, but since this also piques your interest, let us know how you got to writing about, labor, going from mental health, helping people to live better lives and be at peace with themselves, to talking about market systems and the labor theory of value and all these things, perhaps even Marxism, Stalinism, whatever you have. You walk us through it, brother.
Thank you so much. And those are really fantastic questions that require a lot of detail, a lot of time to kind of expound them and draw the connections. So I'll do my best. And if I miss something, please repeat or bring it back up, and I'll do my best to explain or provide better details. And I love the guitar playing. So I think for me, basically for all the guys who are single out there, what you're saying is learn to play the guitar and then you'll get married, right? I'm just yeah. So for all the guys listening out there, yeah, learn to play guitar before you know it. But all jokes aside, I think your first question was trying to understand and define what we mean by terms, right? And you mentioned pretty large concepts that have a good degree of, say, propaganda or ideology, and are deeply contentious. Say the words labor, say the word capitalism. And you also brought up questions related to, say, Marxism, Stalinism. These are very, very controversial topics throughout the world, especially within the Anglo-Saxon culture where I'm involved in, which is, the United States of America, Canada, these sorts of things. These are very controversial terms, so I think we should spend some time unpacking them and maybe getting into the details. I think the first thing to remember is that when we talk about capitalism, capitalism is a very kind of diverse, almost a contentious term itself if you look at some of the historical definitions or what the experts like to argue about, right? So sometimes the best way to understand something is to start to say something is not, right? So maybe taking a bit of a negative approach. Oftentimes, you see this in the discourse, people who advocate for capitalism like to say it's are you saying, or if you critique capitalism, to say, what's wrong with markets? What's wrong with profits? The most important thing to establish is that, um, you know, saying something is capitalistic doesn't mean that it's just related to profit making, right? It doesn't also just simply mean markets, right? The ability to, get a profit through a transaction, right? Um, is predates capitalism. Markets predate capitalism, right? So none of these are unique, and they don't need to necessarily be found in a capitalist system. There are a lot of different sort of political economic systems that have these sort of mechanisms involved in them. And so I think the first place to start is to say, when we're describing capitalism, it's not as simple as to say capitalism just means making money, right? It just means profits. It just means markets and systems of exchange. These are certainly part of capitalistic frameworks, but these are not its distinguishing features, right? These predate capitalism. Capitalism, I think, a good place to sort of understand what capitalism is based on a couple of different factors. One of these factors is that capitalism is kind of based on understanding labor and the employer, right? And this is where we kind of get into the labor theory. All economic and political systems have some degree of hierarchy to them. The way capitalism understands its system of hierarchy is to maybe be differentiated from questions of, say, or perspectives of, say, a feudal lord, right? Think of an old traditional feudal lord in Europe or in Asia or the Ottoman Empire. They had a system of land that they inherited, and they had titles associated with it. And the folks who worked that land were in various subordination to that lord in maybe different classes. Sometimes called peasants, but not exclusively. They could be farmers. Maybe they're artisans, and there was markets involved with them as well. One thing that capitalism does uniquely that distinguishes it from, say, this historical feudal conception of a political economy is that it transforms or transitions that relationship from a feudal lord into maybe an employer. Right? Everyone here probably listening to this podcast knows what it's like to go work a job. I have to work a job. Mustaqim, you're working a job. Everyone is working a job, right? Everyone is an employee at one point and has been an employee at one point, right? An employee is someone who works for a wage, right? Now, this predates capitalism. What's unique about capitalism is that it really centralizes this kind of productive capacity between employer and employee, where the person with capital, by capital, we mean tangible assets, usually money, but it could also mean machinery, for instance, or the ability to kind of develop something and make it productive, right? So, for instance, if I have a bit of money and I have a lot of machinery that allows me to make a factory that sells T-shirts, I could be said to be holding capital, right? So, capital are like very tangible assets that one uses to sort of make something productive, and then I can sell it and make a profit off of it. But me in that position, right, as a capitalist, I sort of need people to work for me because I can't do everything myself. especially if I want to do things at scale. Uh, if I want to, one person can't, physically do everything. You need a lot of people working together in some sort of cooperative way. So what's unique about capitalism, and again, the employer-employee kind of relationship predates this, but capitalism really starts to focus on this being the dominant sort of relationship of subordination within the capitalist economy, where now the capitalists, because they have money and assets, and people who are employees, which is most of us, including myself, sort of need wages because things we need are not given to us for free. No one has a right to have a house, for instance. Right? No one has a right to have food. No one has a right to see a doctor when they're sick, unfortunately, right? So these are often taken out of, they're sort of taken out of the public domain and they're marketized. Therefore, I really need a wage in order for me to access my daily survival needs. So most of us are employees, and we're often employed by an employer who tends to be a capitalist, right? But not exclusively, right? We have government organizations. So I know I'm probably getting into a bit of detail, so let me just take a step back. One thing that really distinguishes capitalism from other political and economic systems, especially feudalism, which tends to predate it, but there are forms of feudalism left, especially in the Islamic world, which we can get into. But one thing that it does is it transitions that sort of productive relationship to be mostly focused on the idea of being an employee who's usually employed by an employer who tends to have most of the control of the tangible assets, the capital assets needed to do something productive, right? And most people have to be employees because we need wages to meet our survival needs. We don't have a choice to be an employee. Now, we may have some choices about where we work based on our level of education and privilege. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes those jobs are taken from us, right? Because it's not our decision, what the jobs look like, how many they are. Those are decisions often undertaken by the firm, which is run by a capitalist, or in a modern corporation, a board of directors. They sort of dictate what that capital and relationship looks like, and how many employees that firm needs, what the nature and features of that workplace look like, and then they advertise it, and then people have to go work in those sort of settings, right? And often those are another big thing that distinguishes capitalism, is that sometimes firms are in competition for the best employees. In theory, employees can walk away from firms. This is very different than slavery. Slavery, you didn't have a choice, you just can't walk away, right? That's sort of what makes it slavery, right? That's a different political and economic system. Under capitalism, in theory, because it's a competitive relationship that is meant to be sort of liberalizing these features, one can walk away from an employer setup that they don't like. That's the theory, at least, but in practice, as you and I know very well, it's very hard for people to walk away from wage relationships because it's difficult to get your survival needs met, right? But of course, I'm kind of articulating the theory. People who are big proponents of capitalism, they often point to these features, and just to be fair to them, even if I disagree, they will often point to sort of the freedom for the employee to sort of change their relationship here. That makes it more progressive than slavery or the feudal system, where people are sort of bounded onto the land and you have a lord and you don't really have a choice of how to work, or these sorts of things. Of course, your employer then has the freedom to take away that job, which they often do, and that leads to all sorts of crises, and that's a big part of our politics, right? So those are two things that I think, and I'm afraid I may have gotten into too many details, so please coordinate me, but those are two things that really distinguish capitalism from other systems. And if we're going to kind of get into more details about why I'm interested in this and how this actually connects to questions of mental health and perhaps spiritual health, this is sort of where we need to start. We need to start at what really makes capitalism unique. It's a way of organizing society between this set of subordinations, right? And most of those subordinations are built on employer-employee wage relationships, right? We need to get a wage to survive because the things that we need to survive, healthcare, housing, food, are not given to us for free. Right? Everything I'm saying should be probably common sense for people. But if we focus on the common sense lived experience that everyone knows, we'll start to understand what makes capitalism unique, right? And so most of us have to go to the market to seek employment in order to get our survival needs met. The few people in society who have the ability to employ tangible capital assets, money, but maybe other things too, they kind of can set the rules, so to speak, of how employment may look like. And so a lot capitalist economies govern, one of its essential features is being governed by this subordination. I'll stop there. Is that a helpful place to start, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. Mashallah. Lots of detail, and we can get into every single one of those as the episode unfolds. And you've given us, and myself in particular, a lot to chew on and a lot to digest. And one of the critiques or one of the pushbacks we get from, are they called proponents of capitalism in this stage? What they will say is that, it's not capitalism that's the problem, it's late stage capitalism. In other words, in their ideal world, they would like to have some of the features of capitalism, like you mentioned, for example, the freedom of the employee to walk away whenever they want. Although, as
Yeah.
you also did concede, practically speaking, that doesn't always work like that, and certain other freedoms we have. And one thing that they always like to point towards is the failed experiments of, they'll always say the Soviet Union, maybe Cuba, maybe Chile, and every other example under the sun that there is. And realistically speaking, there was a lot of amazing stuff that happened in those places, and also a lot of stuff that we take issue with, especially if we look at the Soviet Union and their repression of religion. You and I are both Muslim, so we have more than a couple of words to say about something like that. But is that enough of an excuse to give capitalism the free pass and say it's the best thing that we have and it's the best thing that we'll ever get in the rest of our human evolution?
Wonderful question. I'll try to address that in a couple different ways that maybe helps people maybe take a different approach to these sorts of things. So I think there's a distinction that we need to make. One thing that you're bringing up is a political and economic system. In this case, the mechanisms of what makes a capitalist economy, labor relationships, maybe forms of freedom to leave a labor relationship, right? At least in theory, right? I would strongly push back and against the idea that people can actually actualize this freedom. But anyways, just to be fair to the proponents, that's at least articulated by them. The second thing you bring up, though, is the historical relationship of different societies in the 20th century, Soviet Union, Cuba, for instance, that critique capitalism as well and tried maybe state-sponsored forms of Marxism as they understood it, sometimes called Leninist Marxism, that is meant to sort of replicate what happened in Russia during the Russian Revolution, and their interpretation of what Marx said about religion. All those are really important details, and we should unpack them maybe, as long as you feel like it's not taken away from here. But just to kind of draw back this sort of debate, I think there's a distinction to be made between what is an economic process and then what a society conceives as its individual rights it gives its citizens, right? If we do that, we'll start to see that actually the ledger on the capitalist side tends to be very bloodstained as well, right? So, for instance, you mentioned that we're both Muslim, of course. A lot of the initial colonization of Muslim lands, especially as they sort of grew, as the colonization sort of grew in the 19th century and sort of reached its more industrial height of um, extraction and exploitation. Those were done by international capitalist firms, the Dutch East India Company, the India East Company. These are things that we know very, very well. Um, they were kind of, not, let's just say they were quite bloodstained, right? There's no need to defend them morally. And then if we look at our contemporary period as well, um, the United States gives itself, where I'm based, for instance, it gives its citizens, in theory, a lot of liberal rights, right? So it doesn't intrude on the fact that I'm personally Muslim and other people may not be, right? But how it exercises its power overseas is quite contrary to its liberal rights, right? So I think we need to kind of make these distinctions between what are the rights conceived by citizen societies and what is sort of the economic progress or relationships that they have. They are intertwined at one aspect. But if we look at, say, repression of religion or repression of individual rights, we'll see it's not just the Soviet or the Marxist-Leninist states that have quite a bloody ledger. Uh, the historical process of capitalism, extremely brutal, extremely brutal. Within the Western Hemisphere, the transatlantic slave trade, which kind of went in many different stages. It's not just the same stage. But that was a very strong sort of exploitative, sort of proto-capitalistic framework, right? And slaves can exist within a market society, and America's full of that example. So is Brazil, and so the corporations and the mechanisms of profit extraction, they don't necessarily need to always have employees that can function with that. When it comes to slaves as well, we'll see that ledger is very, very bloody, right? Just as bloody as any of the Marxist states, and just as represses of people's individual rights. On the other hand, there have been, since the 20th century, especially the mid-20th century, there has been growing liberal rights within Western nations, America, for instance, formally, at least legally, getting rid of its own apartheid, which is called Jim Crow, and other sorts of liberal rights that happened in the 20th century that tended to go alongside capitalist economics. That was a big deal, right? Especially as they stood in contrast to maybe the Soviet experiments and the Marxist-Leninist experiments that are happening in the 20th century. But the fact that those are mutually joined at the hip, there's no historical evidence that people's individual rights, say when it comes to expression of religion, for instance, necessarily goes along with any sort of economic or political framework. Those sometimes are negotiated separately, or they can live together, or they can be pulled apart based on the politics of a society. But we shouldn't. It's not as easy as to say, socialism means always the defeat of religion, and capitalism means always the expression of religion. If that was true, then the modern Chinese Communist Party, which is not a big fan of religion, to put it mildly, it tolerates it. It has a very ambivalent relationship with it. It deeply suppresses it, and makes sure it's subordinate to the Communist Party for sure. And in certain cases, in Western China, for instance, they're quite oppressive towards Muslim minorities, Turkic Muslim minorities. They're, everyone would say that the modern Chinese experiment is quite a mix between capitalist features along with some state-sponsored features that kind of align it with the Marxist heritage. But it's a very mixed economy. And for sure, it has enormous capitalistic mechanisms to it. And we'll see that it's actually quite suppressive of some individual rights of that society, right? We can get into debates about how the Chinese political system conceives of those rights, and they would certainly push back and say, no, the most important right that we give people is the right to social mobility and increasing economic privileges, and that's what's more important. And religion and culture and superstition, like all that, is not as important to people as giving them, an improvement of their life every generation. They would certainly push back and say that. For instance, they would conceive their rights very differently. They'd say, what's the point of liberal rights if the United States is completely going backwards when it comes to social mobility and equality? That's their counterattack. I don't mean to get too, again, I feel like I'm getting lost in the details a bit, but I think my thesis, just to kind of bring it back, is that it's not an easy answer. There's no, within the modern day development of all nation states, they can be sometimes liberal, they can sometimes be repressive to people's individual rights, but the historical evidence doesn't point to, capitalism somehow liberating one or putting one on the direction of increased individual rights. That's certainly what its proponents say, but I would certainly contest that history based on things that I mentioned. I think if we do have individual rights within a society, for instance, the right not to be oppressed based on people's religion or ethnic background, those come from internal critiques of that society that utilize a democratic process, right? It has less to do with the type of control that maybe a capitalist has in that society. If the Western societies, especially the United States, has more liberal rights right now, or at least it used to. It's because we had people movements that were democratically based that critiqued the overrunning system, including wage exploitation, and they were able to claw back some rights. Right, that's what the civil rights movement is about within the United States and other movements as well. Those were not given um, as a gift by the political elites who were quite capitalist in our nation. They were sort of pushed back and fought against, and that's sort of what makes these movements really famous. So, if anything, I would kind of fall back to the fact that it's not necessarily capitalism or maybe state-sponsored sort of centralizing communist parties. It has more to do with the level of democratic expression in a society, and if people can generate that sort of democratic mechanisms to give themselves rights or to protect themselves. I think that has a lot more to do with it than an economic or political system.
Mashallah, that's beautifully said. And perhaps one other way that I've seen people counteract this argument is they use, like, proponents of capitalism like to use certain countries as evidence that socialism or communism or what have you has failed. They'll say, look at the Soviet Union, they were not capitalist and they failed. But the irony is that they'll never do that for a capitalist country. No one ever says, look at Saudi Arabia, they're like mega capitalist, but that's not biting them in the behind somehow, somewhere. So I just thought that would also be a way, in addition to everything that you've also highlighted in regards to colonization of the bloodbath and the blood trail that capitalism has behind it. You mentioned something, by the way, which I think...
Mustaqim, can I interrupt for just 1 second? I
Sure,
just
go
want
ahead, bro.
to I just want to expand on that point. Then I'm sorry. Then you can continue. But you were so quick to point that out. The contemporary period. I know I'm speaking largely to a Muslim audience, so many of them have family members or relationships in Muslim majority nations. Say Egypt, say Pakistan, say Chad, Nigeria. These are debt entrapped nations, right? That are largely capitalist, and they're deeply mired in questions of, say, poverty and inequality, right? I mean, everyone knows this as a common sense understanding. They're mostly capitalist, and they have feudal features as well, right? And their ways of developing their economy, um, and they're mostly capitalist based. It's not been great. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. They're debt entrapped societies, right? Because the political elites within those nations have a very exploitative relationship with their population, and they're able to use the wage labor relationship to keep the people sort of, subordinated dramatically, while they wait for each sort of bailout that will come from the IMF or the World Bank, and that keeps them deeply subordinated within the Western economic uh, political economy that mostly comes from Wall Street, which is all usury and riba and all sorts of things too. I mean, these are all very important mechanisms of contemporary capitalism, especially financial capitalism. And so proponents of capitalism, when they just skip over these facts, it's hard to have a, a conversation with them because they're ignoring, not just forget the historical data. They're ignoring the contemporary state of what's called the global South today, which includes a lot of Muslim majority nations. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. King, but I thought that was such an important point, and I don't want to lose that for a second.
Absolutely, and I agree it's an important point. So how would you counteract the people who say, as imperialist as this sounds, because it is,
Mhm.
people who say, well, that's because those people are uncivilized or they're backward. If we have capitalism in the UK or the US, we know how to do it better. We don't have corruption. And the glaring example of that would be someone like Donald Trump. I'm like, you don't have corruption? Have fun with that, mate. But what's your counteract to that sort of line of reasoning? As silly as it is, but sometimes you have to deal with it.
Yeah, I think if I'm going to give them the highest level of credibility to that argument, right? Because I don't want to create a sandman, or say like straw man. I'm sorry, not sandman. I don't want to straw man their argument. I think what they're trying to get at is they're saying that institutions matter, right? So I do agree. Much of the global South has not developed those sorts of institutions. But what are those institutions, right? within the Western nations that are more economically developed, with some differences now, say in Korea and Japan, what is happening in those nations that makes them utilize or go through these capitalist processes that at least bring a little bit more wealth and stability to those societies than that's not happening, say, in the global South. um, I think they would say things like corruption, or these people are not civilized, and those are very discriminatory ways of approaching it. I think the best version of that argument is they're trying to say these countries have institutions, so we need to develop those institutions within the global South. But again, we can unpack those statements. What are those institutions? Those are specifically within the United Kingdom and within the United States, within the Anglo-Saxon sphere, which I know better than other spheres. Those are democratic institutions, right? That enact the rule of law historically, and the rule of law sometimes counteracts what some of the capitalist classes in those societies want. So, for instance, if we pass a minimum wage law, right, most capitalists will not want that. They'll be in opposition to that, right? But within the societies of the United Kingdom, the United States, when they've been able to pass minimum wage laws, right, that's a function of an institution, a democratic institution that's able to enact a rule of law against its capitalist opposition, right? Because, again, going back to the labor relationship of a capitalist, if you're an employee, you're producing something for that person, right? Physically, perhaps, maybe you're producing T-shirts, or maybe intellectually, the different versions of work. Maybe I'm producing, I know you work as a lawyer, so you're producing various forms of intellectual property, for instance, or I'm a professor, I'm producing, whatever it is, we're producing something for our employer. The employer is trying to minimize, or they're in constant conflict and ambivalent relationship with how much they want to pay us, right? Because they need to make sure that their production to wage ratio is meeting their needs, right? That is one of the conflicts. It's a conflictual relationship. Much like a slave and master relationship is conflictual because the slave often doesn't want to be subordinated to the master's whim. So it's a conflictual relationship. You need all sorts of mechanisms to keep the slave in line. Same in capitalism, right? The wage relationship is much the same way. It's a conflictual relationship. The capitalist will want to try to extract as much labor and production as possible from you, which is why folks who are listening to this have, if you've worked a brutal wage job, know that taking off work is really difficult because your employer hates that, even if you have a technical right. They always want to extract more work from you, and you're like, no, I don't want to do that. Like, I'm only getting paid this much. There's a conflict there. It's a conflict in everyone's life, right? So the capitalist classes often oppose, for instance, something that comes from one's institution, a democratic institution. Let's say majority of people want to pass a higher minimum wage. The capitalists will oppose that. Well, in Western nations, we do have a history, and this is something that I wish people understood better. It's not necessarily the capitalist mechanism. It's the democratic institution which comes and disciplines that capitalist class and says, it doesn't matter what you want, you have to pay people minimum. Or when they lose their arm at their job, you have to give them workplace compensation. Within the United States, during the European immigrant waves of the 19th and early 20th century, many of them worked in horrific industrial conditions. There's a lot of wonderful books written about this period, Grapes of Wrath. There are these meat houses and slaughterhouses in Chicago. Child labor is happening. If you give the capitalist class all the power, they will want to put kids to work because you don't have to pay them as much, right? They want to underpay you. This is history. This is what they want. It's hard for them to say they don't want to do that. If they get disciplined, it's by these institutions. And what are these institutions? Like, these institutions are democratic institutions executed by the population that disciplines some of the excesses of the capitalist class. So I would say to anyone who makes that proponent, who's a proponent of that argument, I'd say, yes, you're right. There are institutions in the global South that need to be created, right, if you want prosperity, but the capitalist institutions are not going to do that. In fact, they have to be disciplined by larger populations or versions of democracy. Those are the institutions that produce the corruption It actually, um, increased maybe the wealth or the prosperity of that society, because now the capitalist institution can no longer hoard the profits and the accumulation of that productivity that comes from that subordinate position you may be under, right? This is really, really important. You need another mechanism to start to discipline that instinct to greed that Adam Smith said, is going to be there, and we have to find out a way to make sure that the society prospers. You need a different system. You need ideally a state or a government that can sort of play referee. That's even capitalists agree that you do need a state to play a referee here, because if you just leave the capitalist classes to their own instincts, you'll see rampant um, inequality and exploitation, which is what you have in the global south, right? The problem is the states in the global south are usually not powerful enough to discipline their feudal and capitalist classes, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that. Capital flight; those people can move their money out of the country very quickly. They have people in the police and the military who will support them politically, and oust out any sort of politician who comes to try to create some sort of institution. There are a lot of mechanisms in the world that the capitalist class has to sort of push back against any sort of democratizing or disciplinary movement that comes from the people. Rather, they want to use the state to make sure that the subordinated relationship sort of stays the same, right? So, in summary, to respond to what you're saying, I think this is really important. The reason that in the West there looks like more prosperity because it's allied with a capitalist political economy, yes, right? But they have institutions. We have institutions. What are those institutions? Those institutions are the things that put checks on that capitalist class to redistribute or to minimize the excesses that come from that inherent subordinated labor relationship that I described earlier. If you do not have that, you get rampant exploitation, which is what we see in the global south and especially within the Islamic majority nations. I'll pause there. Is that helpful?
All right. Yeah, very, very helpful. So now, I don't know why I'm giving these people the biggest time of day on this podcast of all places, but then are you saying then that following the line of logic based on your last answer, that
Yeah.
the ideal system in economics would be something with a lot of characteristics we associate with capitalism today, but with strong watchdog institution systems?
I think that's better than rampant exploitation, right? I think that's better than neoliberal exploitation. Um, the neoliberal period, which has been the period roughly since the late 60s, early 70s within the Western world and its relationship to financial capitalism, is one version of capitalism. There are different versions of capitalism, right? And there could be different versions of socialism, and indeed they were. Cuba is sort of different than what Vietnam was, and Vietnam was sort of different than what the Soviet Union was, and Yugoslavia was sort of different. Yugoslavia is actually opposed a lot to the Soviet Union for people interested, right? Just so there are many versions historically of state-sponsored Marxism. There are many versions of capitalism. What you're describing is a version of capitalism that used to exist within the Western nations, primarily, give or take the World War II era, right? And they existed for certain reasons, right? One was that people-led movements, especially within the United States, pushed back against more classical ledger, or the balance being, tilted more towards the capitalist class. The various forms of movements, the New Deal, for instance, in the United States, is associated with that. They have similar things as well within the United Kingdom. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you had the Labour Party that emerged after World War II and got rid of the Conservatives, because the Conservatives, despite them winning the war, they did not want to spend the money to create a national, health service, an NHS, for instance, and to rebuild the nation and to pursue full employment and these sorts of things, because the country had been devastated. Within Western nations, around that World War II era and the decades, after it, that was a very different climate. And those institutions were much stronger, and they were focused on a very, what they call Keynesian form of capitalism, where labor is strong state that disciplines the capitalist class and makes sure that it redistributes things down to labor, which is why within the Western world we saw the highest level, particularly within America, I think in the 50s and 60s, it's the highest level of economic share ever experienced by working class in human history. Immigration comes, everyone wants to get in on that, right? And the common sense understanding is this is a prosperous nation with a lot of laws and regulations. It's true, right? But that's not being led by its capitalist class. It's being led by this sort of balance, this harmonious balance that's happening within society. One of the reasons that that's no longer there and we're experiencing so much for the last several generations, especially now, extreme political blowback, right, is because a lot of the business and capitalist class counterattacks through versions of neoliberalism, right? And you have the Reagan and the Thatcher revolutions, for instance, within the Anglosphere that starts to, get the state out of regulating or playing a referee. And they have their reasons, we can get into that, but the practical effects is they gets the state out of regulating this sort of very delicate, harmonious relationship that needs to exist within this version of capitalism, gets the state out of there. What happens is a power transfer goes to the private sector, and we see less government spending on things like infrastructure, schools, other things that the private sector is not going to spend money on, because how do you draw profit from educating everyone in your neighborhood? It's very difficult to do that. The state needs to do that, right? There needs to be sectors of your economy that cannot pursue profit. That includes infrastructure, right? There's not a lot of profit building a road and a post office to an isolated community, right? Which is why in the United States, a lot of communities have really poor internet access because there's no, the government has not put in, it's tried to, but it doesn't govern, the fiber optic cables. That's all privately held. As opposed to, say, when the government took control over roads, they've tried to create roads and interstate and state structure and infrastructure that connected it to even the most remote parts of the country, because it was done through the public purse. It was done through taxation. It was not done for a profit mechanism. So there are limits to what the private sector can do because it needs to draw profit, and it cannot fulfill certain sections of society. The neoliberal period is, there's a lot of ways to describe it. It's a contested period, but it's a version of capitalism that's emerging in the Western nations, which is trying to get the government out of doing these essential features, giving back power to maybe the worst parts of the capitalist class. There are some parts of the capitalist class that's a little bit more enlightened, understands these mechanisms really, really well. They understand the importance of labor. They're a little bit more Keynesian, right? They would probably agree with 90% of what I'm saying. I've talked to a lot of business owners and capitalists who actually agree because they understand this relationship. But either way, those are sidelined, and they give power to the worst aspects of that class, who see the state and the society as, purely exploitative. And it begins what I think James Kenneth Galbraith, one of my favorite economists here in the United States, calls the advent of the predatory state. This is so key here. I think it's the best description of what neoliberal economics is within the Western world, which is predatory exploitation, right? It's turning the NHS into an American healthcare system, right? It's trying to make it everything in the private sector where you can draw more and more profits off of people. It's the birth of financial capitalism. For an Islamic audience that's listening to this, it's the creation of this usury system, or it's not the creation, it's the centering of a usury Riba system mediated through Wall Street and in New York City and through London, and actually enacting domestically what those countries did internationally to our brothers and sisters, right? It's putting the domestic populations of the United Kingdom, of the United States, of Canada, into a similar relationship with debt and labor and power that people abroad experience all the time, right? It's just making sure those institutions that protected them are eliminated over time. So I think hopefully that helps answer your question about, this version of capitalism that we have departs from some of those structural mechanisms that were put in place by democratic periods that sort of made the economy a little bit more egalitarian, right? It was done to discipline some of the capitalist class. The neoliberal class has counterattacked ideologically and politically throughout the Western world from the 70s onwards for various reasons. And they're in extreme power now, which is why within the United States, you have someone like Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, has his office right next to Donald Trump. Right? There could not be more glaring symbolism to the power of what the private sector now has over every aspect of our life. And if we kind of want to get into what Islam has to say about that, there's nothing in pre-modern Islamic economics that would be fine with this level of exploitation and intrusion into one's private life, right? So that's just an aside to some of my peers who I deeply disagree with, but they're within our community, so I want to be respectful to them. But they often say things like capitalism is Islam and these sorts of things, and they deeply misunderstand these mechanisms. And I don't want to make it personal, but I would just say intellectually they deeply misunderstand these dynamics and mechanisms that makes this version of capitalism extraordinarily exploitative and actually focused on things like Riba and Usury, things that are very much critiqued by our tradition.
Yeah, now that's a beautiful answer. And speaking of the 60s and that period, I guess the best thing at that time was the fact that psychedelics were still legal. So maybe that knocked some sense into some guys, so they weren't as exploitative as some people today. Jokes aside, you mentioned the Islamic community. I wanted to ask, since this leads to my next question, could you please define what is riba or usury? Because there seems to be something of a difference of opinion, even when I ask ulama, Islamic scholars about it, like what exactly is the Quran referring to? Some people have said it's not interest as we understand it today, as in if I'm supposed to pay you back 100, but I spend 2 extra months paying you back, now I have to pay you 200 because of the interest rate. They're saying that's not what it means. That's more of a penalty. What the Quran was referring to was more of a loan shark culture that existed during the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I just wanted your thoughts on that, number one. And number two, expanding upon what you've already said, I've asked, or I have been asked by a lot of people, why I flirt with these ideas of socialism or leftism, leftist economic thought, whatever you have. They ask me, why do you flirt with that instead of Islam? Forget about capitalism and all these isms. What about Islam? And my question will always obviously be, what do you mean Islam? What's the Islamic economic system? Is there even one that exists? I'd like you to expand further on that.
I think I can start with that one first, and then we can get into discussions of Riba, because I think it's really interesting, and they may have. I think those questions are intertwined. Um, I think it's very clear. Well, first, there are two things, right? When people say, and I've read this a lot within certain revivalist movements within Islam, don't do capitalism, because I mean, many people will agree with what I'm saying. They're scared of socialism because they believe it's going to be the Soviet Union kicking down the doorstep and taking your hijabs off, sort of thing, right? Understandably, there's a fear of that because of that relationship. I completely understand, and that's reasonable. Um, but to say that a religion equals a economic system, right? When economic systems, I think, I don't want to bore people with theology, but economic systems are extremely contingent. So they're part of this world, and the world is always changing and impermanent. Whereas I think religion is supposed to transcend you beyond things that are impermanent, right? So how do you live with a changing world, knowing that if you're Muslim, you believe in something like the afterlife, where there'll be judgment in your final abode. Um, I think that's sort of the first principle. It's not that Islam means this economic system in the way it's detailed at this moment in 2024. I think it's a system of ethics that is meant to help transport the believer who believes in something like the afterlife, to help them get safely through this turbulent world, which is very contingent and is very much in change, right? That's where I will start. Maybe it's a very tasawwuf, theological oriented understanding of what I mean by Islamic economics, right? But that's maybe where I'll start. Because if we start there, then we'll start to see that whatever economic arrangements we have in our society should not be judged by whether they agree with a textbook understanding of socialism or capitalism, or maybe the 1,000 different varieties that are found between that spectrum. But what is helping me kind of get like um, like Noah's Ark, like Prophet Noah alayhi salam's ark, from one end of this world to the other, right? And if we kind of take that ethical perspective, then everything's open, right? But everything should be then tested by what's helping people live, I think, spiritually, psychologically, and emotionally fulfilled lives that allows them to transition safely from one end to the other. And I think if we keep that perspective there, we'll see a lot open within all spheres of thought, including, and I think if someone who's lasted this long in this podcast and maybe disagrees with what we're saying is, a very capitalist oriented Muslim, I hope that, in my voice, you kind of hear someone who's at least not trying to strawman capitalism necessarily, but trying to deal with it, seriously, and to see what the benefits are and what versions are okay. I think it's coming from this larger ethical framework, right? And so if we keep this larger ethical framework in mind, we can get out of these sorts of, I guess, maybe culture or ideological wars, which waste our time. We have a very short time in this world, and they're very wasteful if we spend time figuring out, okay, this system is the most this. What we should understand, I think, is the first principle of Islam, which is getting us through this world in some sort of coherent way, right? Getting us to the end of our lives, and to do it with as much accordance with the Prophet, peace be upon him's model as possible. And I think if we do that, then we can choose what we think is best, and we're able to kind of manage the contingency of this world, as opposed to getting locked into place saying this is the only way to be. As the world around us, as Allah has guaranteed, is going to be changing constantly, right? We cannot fix this end of the world. So that's the only way to describe things. We have to describe them through historical contingent episodes within world history, and then see what's the best way perhaps that we think is to be Muslim at this period of time. Because if you don't take that route, I feel like you get stuck. You'll start to think, okay, 800 years ago, the Ottoman feudal era of taxation and these sorts of things is the Islamic way to do things. That's completely false. That's ridiculous, right? That's not true. We don't live in those circumstances. The world has changed. There is no such thing as intellectual private property, right? 800 years ago, there was no Wall Street. There was no this and that. There was no these complex labor systems and international trade and uranium and commodity exploitation. Like, none of that would exist, right? It was a very localized, circular form of economics that people did their best to try to be some sort of stable relationship with, and that's going to look different. We try to take those values and what they were thinking and see what applies now in our very different times that we happen to be born in. So I think that's really important. If we don't do that, then I think we fall into a form of identity politics as a community, where, okay, yes, congratulations, you say you're no longer socialist or capitalist, you're Islamic. Well, what does that mean, right? There's no one detailed way to be Muslim there. When it comes to economics, I mean, there are going to be probably many different pathways because the world is in constant change, right? We have to keep these larger principles in play, and then we figure things out. So that would be my first important place, I think, to start off with. And then going into what I think is your second question, which is the idea of riba, or usury for those who are not Muslim and don't know the Arabic who are listening, which is prohibited, by the way, in the Western biblical tradition as well. There's no way I could adjudicate what the ulama have said about usury. The only thing we can do is to observe that there does appear to be some debate there, right? Something that, the debate is what you just mentioned, for instance. Um, it, I think there's a lot to be said about it, meaning that, a loan shark culture is certainly prohibited by Islam because of its exploitative values. But I also think we need to take a step back and understand what debt is. And I'd point your listeners to people in English who've done some great work on this, Michael Hudson and David Graeber, right, who's passed away now. But they've done a lot of work. I highly recommend them read their work on what debt looks like through human history. Um, in the biblical tradition, they have this concept called the Jubilee, which is a forgiving of all debts, right? We have that in the Christian Bible. Many times, we have prophetic statements, hadith, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is encouraging people to forgive debts as well. Jubilee. Um, this is found, this predates Islam as well, predates Christianity. It was practiced by a lot of Mesopotamian and North African sort of pre-modern civilizations like the Sumerians. I think Michael Hudson has noted even in Hammurabi's code, there is a drive, I could be wrong here, but there's a drive towards Jubilee as well, right? So what's going on here? Like, what is the role of debt in people's lives? Why is it that all these traditions and civilizations are kind of coming to this place where they're very worried about excessive debt in society? Debt is a power relationship. So, for instance, if I loan you money, and it usually means that you need the money and I have it, and you need it to get something you need or to pay your bills because you're trying to survive, I clearly have some power over you. So how I am an ethical relationship to the power I have over you matters a lot, right? And if I believe that I'm a person who's going to be held accountable by my Lord, I will be questioned on how I use my power over you, just like I'll be questioned with every aspect of power and privilege in my life and held accountable for it. So if we keep these ideas in place, then we start to see why exploitation of interest and usury is deeply, deeply forbidden. In fact, it's coming back to the fact that the debt relationship itself is a form of power. And within our tradition, at least how I understand it right now, because it's consonant and congruent with everything else we do, be careful how you use your power, right? Be careful of the percentage we attach because it's a power relationship. We need to be very careful about how we use our power. So I think the verses that condemn Riba and the prophetic statements that urge people to, it's better to forgive. Like, you can loan, but it's always better to forgive. The Prophet, peace be upon him, is trying to teach people, live ethically with your source of power, because debt is a source of power. And if a society gets overly, let's just say, like overly sensitive to the class of people within it that have the ability to loan money, right, and defers to them, then the society becomes deeply exploitative. And if you go into, again, David Graeber's work, Michael Hudson's work, they're so focused on describing the peasant revolutions and the exploitations, the horrible things that happen to people who have to sell their kids to get out of debt. Slavery is a huge part of debt. So much of sexual exploitation happens because families and women go into debt. The debt power relationship and its inherent exploitative features in society are so deeply, I think, causal to all these other forms of dysfunction that happen in our societies. Um, we have to be very careful about how people use their power. And so I think the Quranic critique in the Prophet's model, peace be upon him, is attempting to try to teach Muslims about the dangers of being in that power relationship. And if you are in that power relationship, which debt is, be very careful about the loans and the terms and the percentage of interest or whatever we sign to it. It's better to just to get out of it and to forgive people, or to do things like lend to lease, different forms of Islamic lending models that are advocating the Sharia, things that we can do to minimize that. And if we have Islamic economics that is focused on the legal aspect of making sure we're not charging an interest, but forgetting the power relationship, which I think the whole prohibition is trying to critique. I think we miss a huge feature of what the overall tradition and system is trying to do. It's trying to move people ethically in a safe way to a place where they can be held accountable. Their soul will be held accountable. And when your soul is asked, how did you use power in your life? Right? You at least be able to say, okay, if I was in this power position and I lended someone something and I did not charge them this exploitative rate. In fact, sometimes I even forgave people. Right? That seems to be better for your soul. Right? That seems to be what all our religious tradition, other religious traditions, and other ethical systems are trying to get people to do usually, because they're very concerned about that. And if we don't have that ethical principle in play, we'll have an extremely dysfunctional society, which we have right now within the United States and other places, which are overly solicitous to its creditor class, right? And then you get to promote these loan sharks and these exploitative kind of casino capitalist um, types of people who live in Wall Street, and they don't add anything productive to the economy. They're predators. They extract things. They put people in debt and they extract things. So much of our zero interest credit rates, for instance, within the United States after the 2008 financial crisis, have led to all sorts of really bizarre technological middlemen types of people like Uber and DoorDash. It's created a gig economy. It's all done because of pretty much free money that is then loaned several different times. It's all about trying to create a predatory relationship with a society that creates a commodified relationship with the necessary features of that society, like housing and food and employment, puts people in permanent debt so they're permanently exploited, and that you have a predatory class above it that is not under any sort of ethical compulsion from a religious tradition or even their common sense to not structure their life like that. So I can't, just to kind of summarize, I can't adjudicate the correct definition of what Usury Riba means. It's clear it can mean a few different things, and there's disagreement amongst our ulama. But whatever agreement or position we arrive at, it should not forget the inherent relationship of power, right, and what it does to people and societies if you're overly solicitous to your creditor class, which is what we have today, and not just in the West, but we have debt slavery within South Asia and East Africa, and these people call themselves Muslim, but they could not be more riba exploitative as well, right? This is the dysfunctions we have in our contemporary moment, and this certainly will invite divine anger, right? Because we're not taking care of these injustices. So yeah, and I'll just go back to what I said. I'm originally a therapist, right? I'm talking about all these things. Well, guess what people show up to therapy for? They show up because of dysfunction, addiction, family exploitation, work exploitation. They don't have transportation. These are all these structural things that poverty and inequality do that produce a lot of psychological and health dysfunctions in your life. So I can't be a great therapist, which I strive to be, inshallah, without attending to the structural causes of health and mental health inequality in our society. A lot of it do go down to our society's relationship with, say, debt and labor and exploitation.
Okay, no, mashallah, that's amazing. And I love how when you answer questions, you do give the time of day to almost every side that exists in the argument or the debate, but then you also take ample time to put forward your own perspective and show us your way of looking at it. And I also like how you ended on the therapist part. I just had a weird thought. You're basically like anti Jordan Peterson in that sense. I mean,
I
yeah, I
hope
mean,
so.
whereas
I
yeah,
hope so.
absolutely. I mean, his solution to problems is, well, his panacea or whatever it is that we must return to Judeo-Christian values or whatever, which I'm not sure he follows himself, and all this stuff about lobsters and masculinity, which
Yeah.
doesn't really make sense. But I think yours holds more water. So, Professor Waleed, Brother Waleed, I think where I would like to take this conversation next is that we talked about capitalism, we talked about ethics. But I'm sure you've also heard the statement, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. Because
Yes.
whatever you want to buy, whatever you want to consume, the laptop I'm using now is an HP laptop, and that's on the
Mhm.
BDS list, boycott, divestment, sanctions, because that's one of the companies that's really prepping up the Israeli regime up there. So, yeah, I didn't have a choice when I bought it, and I have to buy a new laptop soon. My choice is very limited. There's HP, there's Intel, there's all that kind of stuff going on, even when it comes to internet. I don't know if you're using Starlink in New York City there. Starlink just started here in Botswana, and the
Okay.
prices are quite cheap. So it's really tempting. But at the same time, I know who Elon Musk is, and I don't want him to have my money. Not that it will make a difference to his billion, gazillion, whatever he has. But that's my perspective about it. If I did go and buy Starlink to have better internet and do better podcasts, would I be doing something unethical? And how far do we push that needle exactly?
Yeah, I think you have the $1 million question, right? It's, there's this old saying in psychotherapy that every increase in consciousness brings an increase in despair, right? So what you're articulating is, now that I'm starting to understand the structural exploitation that it undergirds every action I take in our modern economy, that fills me with fear, right? And grief. And, of course, there's the boycott list, but even if it wasn't, there's a labor exploitation happening in the global south. Or, if I have an iPhone and they're, the famous, or the infamous, I should say, suicide nets outside of Apple factories in China, um, just for me to get on this phone and spend all day scrolling on Instagram. I mean, very quickly, if you start to think like that, because your consciousness is increasing, because you're learning about all these things as a person, it's despair will increase, right? And um, I think it's a very valid question to ask, and that's where the feeling of, is there any ethical consumption in capitalism comes from, because it comes from this therapy kind of cliche that we use: with every increase of consciousness, comes this form of despair. Is there truly any ethical consumption in our contemporary world? I would say, on surface level, it probably can't be, right? On the outside of very few features, because if we take, and I'm not an old school Marxist at all, but I certainly like. Hopefully, I've tried to demonstrate in this podcast. I try to take everything seriously and examine what is the best argument they have. Marxists have wonderful critiques of the capitalist order, because it's designed to critique what you're experiencing, so it's kind of impossible to ignore it. Um, like, I think the Marxists are correct in pointing out the lack of ethical consumption and fictitious commodities and all these sorts of jargony words that come from it. It's hard to figure out where to go, um, and the Marxists will say, everything that's produced is inherently exploitative, because again, going back to the subordinated relationship between employer and employee, the old school Marxists will say, um, hey, the employer has to underpay you by nature. Otherwise, how would they draw a profit? I know we're going to talk about Islamic cooperatives. Maybe that's a potential solution to this, but most employer-employee relationships have, in their opinion, that degree of exploitation, right? So if that is there, then anything that relationship consumes could be impure through different degrees. And there's no good answer. There's no easy answer. We all have to survive and do our best, um, with the caveat being, um, we have to hope that our desire to survive doesn't turn into an excuse. Does that make sense? Right? I don't, I may not have an option with certain things, because it's impossible to avoid unless I live like a hermit by myself in the middle of the forest. And even then, actually, as Ghazali said wonderfully, you need a market to trade with people. Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun and all these great Islamic theorists were really interested in inequality. Ironically, a lot of Muslims are not, for whatever reason, today, but I'll leave that aside. But our great traditional scholars were, even in pre-modern times. But Ghazali even said that you can't live like a hermit in the forest, or society can't, because you need other things from other people, and you need a market and these sorts of things. So it's impossible in one way, but whatever compromises we have to make, let's not make them become ethical excuses, or let's not make them become excuses for the ethical violations of our system, right? Which is where I have a deep disagreement with my Islamic capitalist peers, who are in the majority and they dominate the discourse, right? They produce a lot of literature and material. Of course, I have professional disagreements with them. And a lot of that comes from the fact that I think they may understand some of the things I'm saying here, but they feel like this is the best we can do. So we have to do things like build wealth and maybe that'll help the community. And I think I agree that there may not be a lot of immediate great options, but very quickly that can turn to inadvertent excuse making for them, which I don't want to see. We should not make excuses for this system. We should try to be very clear about its exploitative nature, even if we don't feel like we have an immediate solution to it, at least by ourselves individually. But we should at least not make excuses for it. And if we're not making excuses for it, then maybe opportunities will present themselves to live a life that is a little bit more ethical, a little bit more scrupulous. I think some people can go overboard with this. And it's certainly a reflection of privilege. Certainly the poor and the people who have to live paycheck to paycheck have to just purchase whatever they need on the market, or get whatever service they need to survive. So I think they should be excluded from that. But the people with privilege who have options in the market, like myself, I'm a privileged person. I think the responsibility on me is a little bit higher to think about these things and to be conscious about my consumption, and not be so conspicuously oriented around my consumption as a form of identity and these sorts of things. I think if I have that privilege to make those choices, I should, and other people in our community should hopefully make different choices. And that can open up the space to help the people in our community who do not have those choices available to them, open up a different way of life for them, inshallah.
Yeah, mashallah, that's a very elaborate answer. And I think we all need to examine the level of privilege that we have in various aspects, not just related to the boycott aspect that we just talked about. But now circling back, Brother Waleed, to what eventually or initially led to our contact, which is myself asking you about cooperatives, particularly Islamic cooperatives. Would you be able to elucidate to the viewers what exactly are cooperatives? This is not a new innovation within the entrepreneurial space. In fact, myself being in Botswana also, I grew up looking at these things called cooperatives, and even in my textbooks we saw that this was one sort of department store sort of thing just happening over there. Of course, as a kid I'd never really understood much, and I guess they're not as popular as they used to be back then, but there seems to be a resurgence now with the contradictions of capitalism being laid bare even more than before, particularly post-COVID. But I'd like to give the ball back to you. What are cooperatives? Particularly when you talk about Islamic cooperatives, is there a difference? And is this a panacea to all the problems of capitalism that we've been talking about for the last maybe hour or so?
I think the cooperative is an approach that gets to all the ethical, that I think can mitigate a lot of the ethical problems that we brought up in this conversation, right? And it's because of not necessarily that people are more virtuous who participate in it, though that could be true, right? And I'm not discounting that, but the structure inside the cooperative makes it circular as opposed to exploitative and hierarchical, which is where all the problems start. Even my capitalist peers who have been disagreeing with me throughout this conversation, they understand deeply that, and they'll defend that, hey, a capitalist firm, a business, has to be hierarchical, right? And I would say, okay, but that's where the hierarchy is where problems can emerge. And not to say that you don't need a hierarchy. You do. There are people in certain positions who are better in various forms of leadership or management. But without there being any accountability in that hierarchy, that's where exploitation can happen. If you look at some of the statistics, by the way, you can just go into business literature. And I sometimes have to point my capitalist peers to that. Just examine your own literature. What's the number one reason that people leave their jobs? It's that they're underpaid, but the second biggest reason is that their bosses are terrible, right? Why are their bosses terrible? They can't do anything to hold their boss accountable. Why can't they? It's a hierarchy. You see how that logic works, right? So these are just the fundamental facts of a capitalist firm, right? You can't get rid of it. So what a cooperative does, if we've established that this is how people's work is like every day of their life, and hopefully people listening today are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm in that right now. I have a boss and they don't know what they're doing and they make my life miserable. Once you understand that you live in that hierarchy, and that hierarchy can be very stress inducing, to put it mildly, then you'll understand the virtue of a cooperative, because a cooperative is a mechanism that tries to mitigate that hierarchy. What it does is that a capitalist firm, since it's built on hierarchy, really comes down to the fact that very few people, let's say the business owner, or the board of directors, if it's a larger corporation, however you want to define it, maybe the majority owner, the majority shareholder, right? These are very, very small people, small amounts of people. They have enormous power over the organization. So they make decisions on where to invest money. They make decisions on how much people should be paid. They make decisions on marketing. They make decisions on whether to take certain kinds of loans. They make decisions on where to expand. They make decisions on how to cut jobs, or turn jobs into temporary, temporary things rather than full-time, stable jobs. Um, the hierarchy is kind of determining that stress, right? There's few amount of people in that position, and they're enormously influential on most of the people who work there, right? Those are, however you want to define it, you can call them the bosses. That's the whole labor union term. In today's kind of more corporate sort of financial era, that's a majority shareholder, right? They, and then the board of directors and the CEOs, right? So these are a small cadre of people who disproportionately run everything in your life. And if you're an employee, your entire life is built around your work, right? You have to work 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours, sometimes multiple jobs to meet your survival needs, because no one guarantees them. Our society doesn't believe that you have a right to food and home and shelter and the basics. Capitalist society does not believe that you have that right. You have to earn that right through the wage relationship. So therefore, you're stuck most of your life working, and it's very difficult. And by the way, when my Muslim capitalist peers defend that arrangement, I simply ask them, if you're Muslim, how will they get time to work on their spirituality? Right? Like the pre-modern peers could. And that's not, they don't have a good answer for that, right? Because you're spending your life in a wage relationship, which is going to mitigate your other, other things that you want to do in your life, creative things, religious things, spiritual things, family things. Anyways, getting distracted. But what the cooperative does is it kind of intervenes in that hierarchical relationship, and it sort of makes everyone equivocal. So instead of having a hierarchical relationship where small amount of powerful people in your job disproportionately tell you what to do and you have to take orders, it actually, the ownership of the firm goes to the employees. Very, very simple. That means everyone who works in the firm, in the business, is an owner. So let me make this very simple. Let's say you have a cheeseburger hamburger shop, or a shop that sells fried chicken, right, on the corner of the street. You have like 10 people who work there. Um, and let's say a business owner invested in it and they work there. Sometimes they manage, other times they don't work, right? And it's mostly run by 10 part-time employers who run it 24/7, right? That person who owns that fried chicken shop, that hamburger shop, who invested in it, that's their property, that's their right. They can close it up one day and take 10 of those jobs that are supporting those people and sell it to a bigger corporation, make a lot of money, and that corporation, let's say call it the Fried Chicken Corporation, can come in and get rid of 5 of those people, right? That happens all the time. That's not their decision. They have to just live with the consequences. What if instead that fried chicken shop was owned equally by all 10 of those people, the employers? What if the owner himself was one of the employers? What if Every time they needed to make a decision, they voted on it instead of going under the kind of the auspices and exploitation or various vicissitudes of the owner, right? Or one person. What if the people who actually had to work there all day were equally entitled to make decisions about how late should we keep this open? We've been having a lot of profit lately in the market. Can we give us a wage raise? Why do we have to argue individually with our our employer, business owner, for a 50-cent raise when we have equal access to the books and we know we can give all of us a $3 wage and still maintain our prices increase? If you're at that lower end of the spectrum, going from $7 to $10 wage raise, I'm just giving an example, changes your entire life. And this is my frustration sometimes with certain versions of discourse on Islamic economics. It's entirely unattentive to the question of class. Because if it was, you would know that most people don't have the ability to be business owners or to invest. Most people have to work, right? And if people have to work these exploitative and degrading jobs, going from $7 to $10 or whatever currency you use in your country is life changing. And if you don't know that's life changing, then you've never spent time looking at your paycheck, worrying about your survival needs, being stressed out going to food banks, right? I have some experience with that, right? Not going to food banks, but being extremely stressed out for a lot of my life about finances because my family comes from that background, right? That's a class-based understanding of things. And we don't have enough of that, ironically, in our community, despite making up a good plurality of the global South. So we have a lot of poverty and inequality in our global community. For whatever reason, we're not taking a class-based approach to these questions. We're not understanding what's going on. We just say give charity to the people at the bottom when we have other options, such as changing the structural relationship so they don't have to go get charity all the time, right? Why not change the structural relationship in the firm of how they get their money, make everyone an employee so they can vote equally on where to distribute their goods and services. And they don't always have to ask, they don't, in this made up firm, an example I've used, they don't always have to raise their wages, for instance. They can say, why don't we just take an extra day off? We're making enough money. Why do we need to stay open 24/7? Because it's Ramadan. Why don't I just take an extra day off? Because this is an important time of the year. Why don't I use this to actually benefit my personal life and my family life, my spiritual life? You know, my wife and I have been arguing a lot. We haven't taken a vacation in 3 years because we have to work all the time. But since I'm an employee, an equal part owner of this job in a cooperative, we have voted on taking an extra day off. Wow, I can now pay attention to my kids and my marriage more because I'm not at work. I'm giving very, very simple examples of the power of changing the structural relationship and making people who work at a firm, which is the essence of a cooperative, right? Changing the labor relationship from something that's hierarchical to something that's circular. So if you do, for instance, you know, and the counter from a lot of people who come from a capitalist background will say, okay, but there are certain people who know how to do things better. There's leadership. What are you going to do with them? Of course, we definitely agree with that. What if they were voted on for that position? What if those 10 people voted on their shift manager because that person actually knows everything really well and treats people right, rather than having to put up with whatever boss there is? And what if because that person was voted on to take this leadership role for a small amount of time, they knew they could be held accountable because they don't have more structural power necessarily than everyone else. They've just been granted it for a short period of time through mechanisms of consultation, shura, democracy, those sorts of things. So they may be less likely to use their power in a way that's exploitative because they know they could get voted out and someone else could get put in. This is the essential features of a cooperative firm. And this is what makes them very resilient. There's a study that came out after the COVID-19 pandemic kind of subsided in the United States, that looked at cooperative firms versus traditional capitalist firms as small businesses. And they saw that they survived COVID-19 and were much more resilient in terms of business loss. And they kept their employees in jobs because they were all owned by their employees. So they were actually flexible and they could change things dynamically. They could do things like reduce their hours, reduce their wages, or they had a lot more um, sort of athletic relationship with the market, so to speak, because they understood it deeply and they were all in this together. And so their desire was to keep people's jobs, and so they were able to survive. Whereas a lot of the traditional hierarchical small businesses completely melted down, sometimes through no fault of their own, right? But we have actual empirical data of cooperative firms outperforming traditional capitalist firms in places of in times of true stress and crisis, which is a pandemic, right? And why do they outperform them, even if they're in the same field? You're selling fried chicken, coffee shops, whatever, making cars. It's because of the structural relationship. It's because the employees are more equivocal. It's because there's less exploitation. These are the mechanisms that actually allow your firm in the market to survive and actually do things better. Local communities actually love their cooperative businesses more because that distinction between you're an employer here and you're a member of your community is artificial, right? Someone who works in your corporate superstore is a member of your community. They just happen to work there, right? And people who are in cooperatives, because they often want to stay stable in that community, they want their business to serve that community and they don't want to leave it. The community understands that and they support it more. So that actually increases that increases the usage of their goods and services, which keeps them more afloat because they're more embedded in the community rather than being an alienated corporate superstructure that comes and puts down, a copy and paste fried chicken shop or furniture store or whatever you want to say. These are local people from your local community. They're small businesses, but they're built on a cooperative model, so they're more resilient and they reduce exploitation internally within the firm, which actually makes them better at business. That's the funniest thing when you look into some of the data. It actually makes them better at business. It's not true that having a hierarchical relationship makes your business run better. If that was true, then we wouldn't have enormous small business and medium business failure all the time. It would not be true. We have an enormous failure rate of these small firms. Whereas we have similar firms who are built on a cooperative model, a non-capitalist model, where the subordination between employer and employee is less intense. They, looking at the data, tend to do better, right? Because of these mechanisms. And so going back to your original question, a cooperative way of building a business can be, I think, incredibly important for communities like, say, Muslim communities, which are disproportionately lower in the inequality field. So that means they need more wages, they need more time off. In the global south, for sure, Muslim majority nations, you can see why a cooperative model could really open up people's lives, right, rather than keeping them exploited. Um, a lot of cooperative businesses are very strongly rooted on ethics. So some cooperative businesses you could see being really focused on making sure that um, women who are divorced or widowed, for instance, stay employed so that they're not subjected to exploitation society, right? As opposed to relying on someone running that business to keep your job. And if tomorrow they decide to change their opinion because they want to move their jobs to China, they don't do that, right? So because of these features, communities stay more stable, and more stable jobs in a community create more stable families. More stable families create less dysfunction in a society, and more less dysfunction and more stable families and communities actually create the space and the time for people to go invest and practice in the deeper aspects of being a human, which is creativity, their mental health, their spiritual health. Um, imagine what you could do with your life if you had more time off work, right? And a cooperative can give you the ability to do that, which they do. If you and your people decide that, hey, we're doing enough, let's leave work, because life should not just be about work for someone else. Let's leave because we want to go to, um, it's Ramadan and we want to make sure we're off time so we can go pray, right? Easily. Um, Whereas other Muslim employees don't often have the ability to do that because they're subjected to the labor relationship. And maybe their employer lets them, maybe they don't. Who knows? But it's not their decision, right? And if they cause too much chaos, the employer will fire them and then they're without their livelihood. That's what happens all the time in capitalist setups. So a cooperative, because of its mechanism of non-hierarchy or reduction of hierarchy, let's call it democratically elective hierarchy, not only performs better from a business perspective when it comes to actual goods and services and buying things, um, it can actually allow for what again, as a mental health therapist, this is where I come in, allows for us to work on the deeper parts of ourselves, the emotional, familial, and spiritual parts of ourselves, which get destroyed under capitalism because you don't have the time for them. Hope that.
It does help a great deal. But now I think you've opened up another can of worms when you're giving that explanation, because now the one point that pro-capitalists, whether they be Muslim or not, are going to harp you down on in regards to what you've just said is this hypothetical scenario where they can give that, do you believe that the guy who's cleaning the toilets then should be paid the same amount as the person who's typing something behind the computer, as the same as the person who's doing the marketing? Because it's clearly a division of skill in terms of what goes on behind these jobs and the educational background, if you will. And I think a lot of people will take offense to this, that you say everyone should be paid the same. Or am I just getting it wrong? Please do elaborate on that.
Yeah, there are a couple things, right? I think first of all, the idea that the idea that any labor or any job that someone does doesn't carry a form of dignity that needs to be adequately compensated. I think, for starters, for me, I think that's outside of our tradition. And if people feel that way, and I'm not casting aspersions, I think this is just the common sense that people grow up with because capitalism is so ubiquitous. But under capitalism and other systems, people who have to do the necessary drudgery work, say as a custodian, are seen as not as important, so they don't get paid as much. I can't imagine what would be more contrary to a religious worldview, right? I mean, this is the religion where in Islam it doesn't matter. No one gets to sit up at front for prayer. The only people who get to sit up front behind the imam are the ones who got there before. It doesn't matter what your social class is, what your ethnicity is, right? I cannot imagine a community that organizes itself for prayer when it comes that's not built on social class or even race, but rather who gets there first and who wants to be there first, would be fine with a foreign value system that assigns economic merit from arbitrary market calculations that come from a completely foreign value base, which is capitalism. Completely foreign, right? It's completely foreign even to, I think, most religious traditions, right? It's very, I would push back deeply to ask people, where do they get their values from? That cannot be the same value system that is part of your religion. Because when you die, um, from what we understand, God's not going to care if you were sweeping your floors or you're the CEO of your firm, right? That's not going to matter what the end state of your soul is. So if that doesn't matter, right? If anything, there's a higher chance because the person who was sweeping the floors they live their life with a lot more exploitation, and they don't have the power to hurt others. It may be easier for them. There's that famous line in the Bible that it's easier for a rich man to go through the eye of the camel than I forgot what the verse is, than a rich man to go to heaven. It's easier to go through the eye of the camel than for a rich person to go to heaven. I mean, there's a reason for that, right? And we can't escape these values, like why there's why we have Surah al-Takathur in the Quran, right? Like there are reasons that these warnings exist for just that. So anyone who first feels that way, I would caution them to ask them. I caution to ask them where they get their values from, because if we think that one job is inherently deserving of a better livelihood that allows one person to live unexploited versus one who does have to live with more exploitation, when at the end state it doesn't matter, right? Because that's not what your judgment will be. That's a very foreign imposition of values. I would caution people to think very deeply about where they get their values from. Now, on the practical level, because there's a practical concern, it could be true that the person who is a secretary or sweeping, who may not have this advanced education, it's also true they don't have to make as much, right? But what's clear is that they're involved in that process. So they help set your salary, you help set theirs. Maybe we need to have a sit-down conversation with people who work their jobs, and we need to look them in the eye and say, I think you deserve less to make less than me because you have to sweep the toilet, right? Maybe people are actually scared of testing their values. I'm not a fan of that. I think that's incredibly important and necessary work. And so they don't have to make as much as me. For instance, if I have more higher educational credit, maybe they will agree too. But I should at least sit down and say, what do you think you need? Because that person deserves the privilege to invest in their family, emotional, and spiritual life as much as I do. And my higher education should not privilege me more to that because I have more control in my work. There's this wonderful studies done by Michael Marmot, who's one of the head physicians of the World Health Organization. And he sort of pioneered what we call the social determinants of health model. He's a United Kingdom physician, and he started to understand this model when the United Kingdom government hired him to look at the health of the employees of Whitehall, which is the official kind of government headquarters of the United Kingdom in London. And he took kind of depression, anxiety, pulse, healthcare, all the vital signs of people in different floors, right? And the way that Whitehall kind of worked was the higher you go up in hierarchy, the more you go upstairs, the more privileged your position became, right, in the government. People at the bottom were sort of secretary stock workers. And you start to look at the health and mental health of everyone, hierarchically divided by floor. And when the ones at the bottom, the ones who had to work on the drudgery of keeping the whole place running, had the worst health and mental health outcomes. And he kind of tried to figure that out. And he said, what's going on here? Why do they have less lifespans than the people working above them? Why are they more likely to have metabolic syndrome? Why do they report as more anxious, chronic anxiety at their jobs? Why are the women here disproportionately not married, right? They're single mothers who are struggling, or maybe they had a child out of wedlock and they're struggling to, like, why is this true? And why is it that as we go up the hierarchy, people are more likely to have better health and be married? What's going on here? And he came to this understanding, which helped pioneer the social determinants of health and then mental health model, which is the standard across the World Health Organization. The more higher up you go up in hierarchy, the more control you have in your life. That's it. The more feeling of control in your job is the pathway to health and mental health and family stability. And so when I look at, in this hypothetical example you gave me, it's very hard for me, I feel, as someone who would take their faith and their values seriously, to say I deserve more privilege and control over my job than you do. You're consigned to a life of higher metabolic syndrome, um, maybe more family instability because you don't make a lot of money and you have to be here all the time. I would feel very, very nervous making that value judgment and then being like, yes, uh, I'm on the dean, as they say. I'm on the hook. I would feel very nervous making that statement. It doesn't mean that everyone makes the same amount. That's not what cooperatives do. In fact, cooperatives do have hierarchy, pay hierarchy. But what they have is much more minimized inequality, which makes everyone feel better and more engaged with their job because they're treated with more respect and they're given more control. And the reason they have less inequality across wages and healthcare and benefits is because they have to sit down and decide these things together. And when you sit down and you talk to another person who's in these positions, you realize that they're just like you. And maybe you guys all don't get the same thing, but if you have a degree of control over your job, why not make everyone's life a little bit easier if it's able to? Or at least we're working together so that person feels, if they do, and they should, people at the bottom of that work hierarchies, they're absolutely essential to keeping the world running. Hopefully everyone learned this lesson during COVID-19, where the folks who could kind of work from home were privileged to do that. And the folks who still had to go do the necessary features of society, they were more exposed to risk and health. And they were barely adequately compensated, right? So we can't escape these realities. There are certain people who need to do these jobs. Other people don't want to do these jobs. That doesn't mean they have to be consigned to a life of worse health, mental health, and social and spiritual instability. I don't think that's true. If we can control that and mitigate it through, say, a cooperative model, which we have a lot of evidence that we can, why not go for that? Why wouldn't that be closer to the values of a dean that says, guess what? It doesn't matter what your social class is. If you don't show up to prayer on time, you have to pray in the back, right? Or a dean that says it doesn't matter if you're a king or a slave, if you're a prime minister, if you're a man or woman, if you come from this ethnicity, everyone has to wear white when they go to Hajj, right? So clearly, I think the dean, in its basic, uncontroversial practice and statements and rituals, is sending us very clear messages about why Islam is very egalitarian. In fact, radically so. We should not just make this fine demarcation that, okay, that's the religious ritual where we're egalitarian, but as soon as that's done, the rest of the society should be built on hierarchy, which privileges me, you know. So those are some of the ways I would try to convince someone who thought like that and was coming from our community. Those are some of the things I want to talk to them about.
MashaAllah. Beautiful, beautiful answer, and lots of gems of wisdom that you've been imparting on us on the 2 hours that we've been together. Alhamdulillah. Now we are at the stage of the podcast, Professor Waleed, where I sort of flip the script and I allow my guest to ask me a question or series of questions. So what would your question be for me?
So my question is, Mustaqim, how can, I feel like, you and I, agree on a lot of these principles. How can we start to generate a different discussion within our communities, whether, faith communities or non-faith, people that we're close to? How can we start to generate a different discussion that's aligned with what I think their values are and kind of pushes back against some of these common sense assumptions that we're born into? What's your perspective on this?
That's a brilliant question, and it's one that I may have to formulate a proper answer to, and I'm probably going to build off a lot of what I've learned from you in the time that we've spent together, simply because I am quite passionate and opinionated about it. Yet in my passion and in my emotion, perhaps I don't have the opportunity to formulate the best arguments that I could. But I think at the core of it, my answer would like to be pinned on the fact that we have to look past individualism. We have to look at ourselves collectively as a community. And I'm speaking primarily as an African Muslim, but as a human being over and above that. Why I bring up Islam is that when Imam Madhar Mahmood in season 2, first episode, he spoke of someone who taught Sahih al-Bukhari, and that's great that you are teaching such an elevated book and you're teaching the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but at the same time, this person had no problem whatsoever exploiting Syrian refugees. Now, exploiting any refugee is nothing short of a crime, whether you believe in the justice system or not. The fact that we have probably witnessed one of the largest atrocities in our lifetime in front of us, and someone who teaches the words of the Prophet ﷺ doesn't feel anything exploiting these people, underpaying them, that's a huge disappointment to someone whom I have to share my faith with, share my belief system with. And as I said, at the core of it, it goes back to looking beyond our own personal needs and wants, and wanting to use Islam to serve ourselves and serve our egos, and branching it out to making it a tool of service to the community and to humanity at large. And why I brought up the fact that I'm an African Muslim is because I'd like to meld this answer of mine with my African culture. I know, Brother Waleed, you in the States must have heard about this word Ubuntu, which is more from South Africa. Like, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Zulu inspired or Zulu dialects. We have the same word in our language in Setswana. It's called Boto, and we can loosely translate it to being together, helping out, having a big heart and lending your helping hand out there. And I think if we are to address this problem, whether it be from the socio-economic aspect, we have to keep this principle in front of us, that this world that we live in, the community that we share, the masjid that we go to pray in is not mine alone. It is one that I share with others, and my consideration of others should also be at the forefront of my actions.
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully put. I think all traditional human systems have, again, I'm in the United States, so there's sometimes discussion about Indigenous Native Americans, and they have very circular communal practices as well that are economic and social, and they would jive very well with pre-modern Muslims, how they conceptualize these things as well. I think all communities that predate capitalism, even when they did have, in fact, I would say, because hierarchy and exploitation is so dominant in human history, societies had to develop kind of almost, how your body develops white blood cells to attack foreign diseases as a way to defend yourself. All societies, all traditional societies had to develop the white blood cell immunity counterattack against the exploitative people and elements within them. And Riba, or sanctions against Usury and Riba, is one Islamic white blood cell immune system defense against people's in power's desire to exploit others, right? And there's a lot more examples like that. You don't even have to go into some of the economic principles within the Quran. You could just look at, like I mentioned, the rituals of prayer. How we line up to pray. We know this from the beginning. It's not social class based, and this is revolutionary. If you go into the Sirah, there are arguments over how come this guy from this tribe gets to line up here? How come this one from this ancestry gets to line up here? When Islam went into South Asia, and which has very strict, and under traditional Hinduism has very strict hierarchies between in caste, and the impure lower caste can't be with the higher. I mean, Muslims were praying. People were shocked. How would you? Are you saying wudu just purifies everyone? But there's inherent differences, and I mean, I think people need to study their Islamic history. Even if they're not Muslim. In fact, people who are not Muslim, when they learn about these things, they're very interested. They're very interested in some of these egalitarian elements that we take for granted, perhaps, of being in the tradition, and they see it as quite revolutionary and quite therapeutic for them, right? Because our lives are built on so much exploitation and things like that. So I think we should we should take seriously some of the basics of the tradition, because they quite glaringly point out that we should be living our lives a little bit differently, that are more in consonant with people of Fitrah. I would say the Fitrah understanding of Ubuntu that you mentioned, it's very Fitrah. This is and Islam is a deen of Fitrah. It's just common sense, communal solidarity, common sense. We have to reduce exploitation because we're in this together. I think to me, it's just a common sense feeling of wanting to be in harmony with people around you. And then lastly, unfortunately, the example that you brought up of people in power exploiting the weakest. I mean, I'm not surprised, and I'm I'm not surprised. I'm shocked, but not surprised, as they say. And I think to myself, and maybe this is a bit of my own soapbox, but how could a community not a, and maybe this is another question I was thinking, how come we've never gone to a khutbah or halaqah where people have not talked about the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, pay the wage labor before his sweat dries? Or that the Sahih Bukhari hadith where, God will be against three people, one against, exploiting the slave, and the other, the third category is taking from the labor their unjust due. I mean, this is a Sahih hadith, Bukhari. Why don't we hear everything else? Why is it that our community has, within our own authenticated indigenous interpretive sources, where these are very strong sayings and traditions, why don't we hear about them? Right? They're right there in front of us. I'm not a religious scholar by any sort of training, but if I can quickly find these things, then why is this not centered or an important part of our discourse when it comes to questions of social justice? And that I can't help but feel cynical that it seems like in our contemporary moment, the drive to make so much of the tradition be comfortable for people who come from a privileged social class is overriding the basic egalitarian elements that are found just glaring at you, right? That you don't have to do any interpretive difficulty with. Everything that I mentioned should be a common sense to a mainstream Muslim here. I'm not saying anything that's been completely revolutionary. So if it's that glaring to us, why is it not being centered? And the only conclusion I can arrive at is because it's trying to be made palatable to people of a certain privileged mindset where they can do their Islam and never have to think twice about, oh yeah, I can underpay people. Why not? And if they've not ever heard khutbahs or halaqas or discourses where that's extremely sanctioned against as much as anything else, naturally the community will continue this form of exploitation. We have so many bonded laborers in South Asia, Muslims bonding people keep debt slavery. They're farmers and people who commit suicide all over South Asia for this reason. I would love to hear a khutbah or halaqah that angrily thunders against that, right? Because you're in violation of a million different precepts there, right? Then why don't we hear about them? Why do we hear, not that other things aren't important, but this should at least be part of the conversation. This should not be an alien conversation where no one has ever heard these connections before in their tradition. And I'm afraid to say if it's not there, then the community will become more palatable for people who are privileged, because it won't challenge them to think like this.
I mean, you're absolutely correct when you talk about how it seems that one class has sort of commandeered the narrative so that our khutbahs, our lectures and everything flows a certain way. And it is, as I used to say in season 1, and this is still the bedrock of my podcast, one of the reasons why I started this podcast is to bring out these conversations that we don't hear at the Jum'ah khutbah for whatever reason, because it's not politically correct or because it won't be sanctioned by the management committee and so on and so forth. That's why I started The Scholar and the Students, one of the reasons why I did. And alhamdulillah, it's allowed me to unearth wisdom from a variety of guests, including you, Brother Waleed, and allowed me to learn from them meld my own personality and chart a course that I wanted to chart in this dunya, and hopefully it'll be of use for me in the akhirah. So I'm not saying that this is the panacea, or this is the solution to all the problems that we've been talking about, but I think it's a drop in the bucket. It's a step in the right direction, and I am happy that it is allowing those conversations to come to light, and I am praying and I'm hoping that it continues to be that beacon of light, so that we have more conversations such as this and elucidate about all these concepts and everything else that the ummah, that our community needs to hear about. And I'm indebted to you, Brother Waleed, for accepting the invite to come on. I'm not a very big guy, but for all our viewers and listeners out there, where can we find more of your work? Is there anything published that we can read? Where can we contact you? Please let us know if there's an email address or something. We'll put it in the description down below. Where can we find you? Where can we find Professor Waleed Sami?
You can find some of my published work through Google Scholar. I'm personally, I'm not that much of a, and maybe this is a problem I'm trying to rectify. I don't publicly do a lot of these things. So this podcast is an attempt for me to publicize a lot of these things. So I'd say to be determined, but of course, if folks are interested in communicating with me and connecting to some of these sources and working on these things, they can email me at my private email address, or I can give my college email address. It's W as in my first name, Sami, at ccny.cuny.edu. So WSAMI at ccny.cuny.edu, right? They can Google search me and find my profile there. And we can have this conversation, and I'd love to come back again. And Lord knows that we don't talk enough about these things. So the credit goes to you, Mustaqim, for putting on this discussion and trying to publicize it. And finding me, even though we're an ocean apart, I feel very connected to you, and we're all very connected who care about these things. So the credit goes to you, and I hope that you continue doing this really important work, and we can continue to have these conversations.
Excellent. And you're making me a bit bigger than I'm actually am, but thank you once again for accepting the invite and for your kind words, Brother Waleed. And I'd love to have this conversation extended with you again, and let's just keep in touch either way, whether there's a podcast or not. Let's just stay and, foster that bond of brotherhood. So, alhamdulillah, dear viewers and listeners, it's been close to 2 hours that we've been sitting through this ride together. We thank you for your attention, for coming out this far and listening to the first recorded episode of Season 4 of the Scholar and the Student podcast with the one and only Professor Waleed Sami. There was a bit of a joke that we made initially because of the whole, we thought that we'd put clips of this podcast on TikTok, but then TikTok got banned, and now, it's back. But maybe we'll just put this on Red Note, because that's the type of content that gets pushed out there. But yeah, I don't know if that'll be a threat to Brother Waleed's job. But yeah, Red Note, TikTok, all the socials. Find us there, like, share, and subscribe for more content such as this, Botswana's first Muslim podcast. We bid farewell to Professor Waleed Sami all the way in New York, and this has been myself, Moss, from Khabaruni, Botswana, from the Scholar and the Student, Botswana's first Muslim podcast. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.